"You're fired." The words hit the service kitchen harder than the copper pan Rosalie Bennett had just emptied into the sink. For half a second, nobody moved. Steam curled above the drain. A tray of seared beef waited under heat lamps. 2 assistants stood frozen beside the plating station. Lorenzo Carvelli stared at Rosalie with the controlled fury of a man who rarely raised his voice and therefore made it matter when he did. 10 minutes earlier, Rosalie had broken the seal on a fresh spice container and found the inner liner already disturbed. Then she noticed the sauce tasted wrong, not poisonous, not identifiable, simply wrong enough that she refused to send it upstairs. She had dumped the first pan before anyone could serve it. Lorenzo had walked in at exactly that moment. "Did you ruin that?" he had asked. Rosalie had met his eyes and answered, "I threw it out." She had intended to explain after she stopped the second pan. Instead, he roared the sentence. Everyone in the Carvelli residence understood immediately. Rosalie untied her apron with steady hands. "Then don't let anyone serve the second pan." Lorenzo's anger had been waiting for somewhere to land. For 3 days, his security chief had been tracing a leak from inside the household. Details of a private family meeting had appeared where they should not have. Tonight's dinner mattered because Adrian Carvelli, his late mother's brother, was considering whether to remain in a joint hospitality deal. That deal would close one of the family's more questionable revenue channels. Lorenzo had spent the day fielding warnings, denials, and half-truths. Then he entered the kitchen and saw the chef responsible for his family's table pouring hours of work down the drain without permission. In another house that might have looked like waste. In his, unexplained behavior inside the private kitchen looked like risk. Chef Marco started to speak. Lorenzo stopped him with one glance. Rosalie folded the apron over her arm. She did not cry, apologize, or ask him to reconsider. That irritated him almost as much as the wasted sauce. "Leave your keys with household management," he said. "Fine." She turned toward the door. Behind her, a young kitchen assistant reached for the handle of the second pan. Rosalie stopped before Lorenzo did. "Don't open that." The assistant froze. "Chef, step away from it." Her tone changed enough to cut through the room. Lorenzo's attention sharpened. Rosalie crossed back to the stove. She ignored the fact that she had technically been fired and pulled the pan away from the heat. When the lid lifted, a faint, bitter odor rose through the rich smell of stock and herbs. It was subtle. Lorenzo would not have noticed it. Rosalie did, because she had spent the last hour tasting every stage of the sauce. She reached for a small food safety testing strip from the drawer used for sanitation checks. She stopped herself. "This won't tell us what's in it," she said. "More to the kitchen than to Lorenzo. But it can tell us whether something is off enough that we shouldn't serve it." She tested a small sample. The strip shifted outside the expected range. Rosalie looked at Marco. "Kill service on both pans. Use the backup just from the walk-in." Only then did she turn to Lorenzo. Less than half a minute had passed. "Now you can fire me." The regret did not arrive as emotion first. It arrived as arithmetic. 1 sealed ingredient opened incorrectly. 2 compromised pans. A temporary porter Rosalie remembered seeing near prep. A private dinner upstairs with Adrian, Lorenzo's sister, 2 senior associates, and a guest. That guest's illness in the Carvelli residence would become both scandal and leverage. Lorenzo looked at the discarded sauce, then at Rosalie. "Nobody touches anything," he said. His voice had returned to its usual quiet register. That meant everyone in the room moved immediately. Security was called. Service was delayed. The backup just went upstairs with a bland explanation about a kitchen equipment issue. Rosalie remained beside the prep table while a security officer photographed labels, seals, utensils, and access points. Lorenzo watched her answer questions with precise, irritating calm. She had noticed the spice seal because the inner liner had been lifted and pressed back down unevenly. She had noticed the sauce because the second taste was more bitter than the first. She had noticed a temporary porter near the prep station because he had no reason to be there. None of it proved poison. All of it justified stopping service. Preliminary screening from the household's contracted food safety service did not identify a specific substance that night. It confirmed the sauce contained a foreign contaminant inconsistent with the recipe and unsafe to serve. That was enough. Lorenzo stood in the pantry with his security chief, while the rest of the kitchen reset dinner around a new sauce. "The temporary porter," he asked. "Agency replacement. Started this afternoon. Badge shows he entered cold prep twice. Why? No assigned task there." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. Through the glass partition, he could see Rosalie helping an assistant replate vegetables, even though she no longer worked for him. She moved with the same authority she had before he fired her. It wasn't that anyone had restored her title, and the kitchen still trusted her. Adrian entered from the dining room, took in the security activity, and looked directly at Lorenzo. What happened? Lorenzo gave him the short version. Adrian listened, then glanced toward Rosalie. "So you fired the one person who noticed what your security missed." Lorenzo's expression hardened. Adrian's did not. That was not a question. When the dinner finally resumed, Rosalie was still in the kitchen. She had stayed because leaving in the middle of a food safety incident would have punished the staff. Not Lorenzo. That distinction mattered to her. She supervised the backup sauce, checked every garnish, and made sure the temporary porter's station remained untouched for security. Only after the final plates went upstairs did she wash her hands, collect her knives, and place them in the worn leather roll she had carried for years. Lorenzo entered as she tied it shut. "You are not fired." Rosalie did not look up. "That is convenient. I made a decision without the full facts." "You made a decision before asking for them." Lorenzo's face went still. Rosalie slipped the knife roll into her bag. "Those are not the same thing. I was wrong." It was clearly not a sentence he used often. She looked at him then. "Yes. Come back tomorrow." "No." The answer was immediate enough to alter the air between them. Lorenzo stared at her as if the word itself were a problem, requiring analysis. "You prevented contaminated food from reaching my family. I did my job. Then, continue doing it." Rosalie gave a tired laugh. "You still think this is about whether I can cook for you?" She stepped away from the counter. "I work in a kitchen where one unexplained decision got me fired in front of my staff. You did not ask why I dumped the sauce. You did not ask whether I saw something. You decided that because you were angry, and because this house belongs to you, your conclusion was enough." Lorenzo's expression cooled. "There are reasons I react strongly to unexplained breaches in this house. I am sure there are. That does not make me responsible for them." She should have been intimidated. Everyone else in the residence was. Instead, she looked almost disappointed. Which was worse? If I come back under the same rules, then tonight happens again, the next time you are scared of the wrong thing. The word scared landed badly. Lorenzo stepped closer. Not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that most people would have retreated. Rosalie did not. "You think I was afraid?" he asked. "I think you were afraid someone inside your house was betraying you. And I happened to be standing in front of you when you needed a culprit." His jaw tightened. For a second, the kitchen seemed to fall away around them. Rosalie was aware of his size, the expensive, dark suit, and the quiet menace he carried through rooms. She also knew she had just accused the head of the Carvelli family of acting from fear. She also knew exactly what she had seen in the sauce, exactly why she had stopped service, and exactly how quickly he had dismissed her judgment. "You were wrong about me," she said. "That bothers you because you are used to being right before everyone else catches up." Lorenzo should have ended the conversation. Instead, he found himself looking at her differently, not because of the curve of her body beneath the black chef's coat, though he noticed that too, not because she had saved him from embarrassment. It was that she had no interest in turning his mistake to her advantage. She had not demanded money, threatened a lawsuit, or put on wounded dignity for an audience. She had simply said no. Behind her, the kitchen continued moving. Luis, from Dish Pit, carried racks to the sanitizer. Marco checked the backup stock. Rosalie had built authority in this room without owning any part of it. Lorenzo owned the house, the restaurant contracts, and half the businesses supplying the food. Suddenly, he understood that ownership had not helped him see what she saw. "What do you want?" he asked. Rosalie lifted one eyebrow. "For tonight. For you to come back." She considered him long enough to make silence uncomfortable. Not more money. Lorenzo had been about to offer it. That irritated him. Not a promotion either. His expression changed by a fraction. Rosalie almost smiled. "You really are predictable when you are trying to fix something. Then tell me what is not predictable." She adjusted the strap of her bag, a written rule that food safety decisions belong to the kitchen unless security has evidence of deliberate misconduct. Direct access to security when I see something wrong. And if you think I am incompetent or disloyal, you investigate before you humiliate me in front of staff, unless there is immediate danger. Lorenzo studied hair. "You have prepared terms." I had 30 seconds to think about them. That almost earned a smile. Almost. He looked toward the service door, where 2 security officers were sealing the contaminated pans for collection. Then back at Rosalie. The instinct to say done came quickly. The instinct to order her back came faster. He suppressed both. Tonight had already cost him too much certainty. "I will review the terms in the morning," he said. Rosalie nodded. "Good. And if I agree..." She picked up her coat. "Then I decide whether I come back." Lorenzo's gaze sharpened. "You are enjoying this." "A little." She walked toward the door. He stopped her with a question instead of a command. "Rosalie." She turned. Lorenzo held her eyes for a moment, visibly disliking the unfamiliar shape of what he had to say next. "What will it take for you to come back?" Rosalie looked at him. Then, at the kitchen, he had nearly removed her from 30 seconds before understanding why she mattered. "Ask me tomorrow," she said, "after you learn how to listen." Rosalie returned to the Carvelli residence the next morning at 9. Not because Lorenzo had summoned her, but because Chef Marco had texted that security needed a full reconstruction of the kitchen timeline. She arrived in ordinary clothes with her knife roll still at home and found the service corridor quieter than usual. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone also knew Lorenzo had fired her and reversed himself before dinner ended. That kind of mistake became gossip, even in a house where gossip could cost people access. Rosalie entered the kitchen and immediately saw Lorenzo standing near the prep station with his security chief and 2 printed reports. He looked as if he had been awake all night. "You came," he said, "to answer questions, not to work. I heard you the first time." Rosalie glanced at the reports. "Good. That saves us both time." The security chief hid the beginning of a smile. Lorenzo did not. He handed Rosalie a copy of the kitchen access log. The temporary porter entered cold prep twice and dry storage once. None of those locations were on his assignment sheet. Rosalie looked down the list. He was also near the spice delivery. Lorenzo's gaze sharpened. "You remember that I remember people who stand where they are not supposed to." The investigation stayed practical. No dramatic confession appeared. Security pulled badge records, delivery timestamps, agency paperwork, and kitchen camera angles. The porter had signed in under the name Calvin Reese through an outside staffing agency used whenever the residents needed emergency coverage. His references were thin but technically valid. The first camera showed him unloading produce. The second showed him carrying empty bins past the cold prep room. A third angle caught him standing near the spice shelf for less than a minute, while everyone else focused on a delivery dispute near the loading entrance. That minute mattered. Rosalie watched the footage twice. "There," she said. Calvin reached toward the shelf, then turned when someone entered. Lorenzo leaned closer to the screen. "Can you tell what he touched?" "No, and I'm not going to pretend I can." She pointed toward the prep cart. "But that spice container came from that shelf. The seal was wrong later. That gives security a timeline. It does not give you proof." Lorenzo looked at her. "You are very careful about the difference, because kitchens are full of people who get blamed for mistakes they did not make." After the interviews ended, Lorenzo asked Rosalie to stay. She almost refused on principle. Then she decided she wanted to know whether he had actually listened. They met in the small breakfast room rather than his office. That surprised her. On the table sat coffee, her written terms from the night before, and a second document drafted by household counsel. "You had lawyers involved before breakfast," she said. They were already awake. Rosalie picked up the document. It gave the family chef final authority to halt food service on safety grounds and direct access to household security for contamination or access concerns. It also required a formal review before termination for performance or misconduct, except in cases involving immediate danger, violence, or confirmed theft. Rosalie read every line. "This is better." Lorenzo leaned back. "That sounds dangerously close to approval." "Do not rush." She tapped one paragraph. "This still lets household management override kitchen decisions for operational necessity. Remove that. There are situations where service must continue. Not if food safety is the reason I stopped it." He looked at the clause. Then, at here. Fine. Only after the document was corrected did Lorenzo make the mistake Rosalie had expected. "Your salary will also increase." She put down the pen. "No, you have not heard the number. That is why I said no now." His expression cooled. "This is not compensation for being fired." "Then why are you offering it today?" Silence. Rosalie folded her arms. "Exactly," Lorenzo said. "Your responsibilities are being expanded. Then adjust the salary after a formal role review next month, the same way you would if last night never happened." He studied her. "You do not make anything easy. That is not why you hired me. I did not hire you personally. You fired me personally." The line landed harder than she intended. Lorenzo looked away for 1 second, then back. "Fair?" Rosalie almost smiled. "That sounded painful too. You are becoming repetitive. You keep giving me material." She signed the revised terms before noon and returned to the kitchen that afternoon. Not because Lorenzo had won. Marco was juggling 3 menus, and Louis had been pulled into an interview. Rosalie knew exactly how much extra work one missing chef created for everyone else. The staff noticed the difference immediately. She was no longer merely the person responsible for family meals. Security had added a direct line beside the kitchen office. New Tampa evidence seals arrived for high-risk ingredients. Temporary staff access was restricted by zone. Lorenzo had ordered the procedures, but Rosalie recognized something else. He had implemented them across the house instead of designing special rules around her. That mattered. What bothered her was how often he came downstairs afterward. Once to review inventory procedures, once to ask whether the new seals worked, once to discuss a dinner menu he could have approved by email. By the 4th appearance, Rosalie looked up from a cutting board and said, "Do you actually have work upstairs?" Lorenzo glanced at the onions she was slicing. "Yes." "Then this is becoming suspicious. I own the kitchen. You own the room. I am using the knife." Adrian noticed too. He arrived for lunch on Thursday and found Lorenzo standing near the pastry station while Rosalie explained why an imported cheese had been rejected for inconsistent temperature during delivery. Adrian waited until Rosalie walked away before saying, "You have been in this kitchen more this week than in the last 3 years." Lorenzo did not look at him. There was a security failure. There was also a chef who made you look foolish. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. Adrian smiled faintly. "Ah, that is the part." "There is no part." "Of course not." Adrian leaned against the counter. "Then, this will be easy. Do not turn gratitude into ownership." Lorenzo turned his head slowly. "I am not grateful." "No, you are fascinated. Worse." Lorenzo's stare would have ended most conversations. Adrian had known him since childhood. She said no to more money. No to a promotion. And made you rewrite policy before agreeing to return. You are not used to people refusing things from you. Lorenzo's voice lowered. "Be careful." Adrian's expression softened. "That is exactly what I am telling you." Rosalie did not hear that conversation, but she felt the change in Lorenzo's attention. He watched differently now, less like security, more like a man trying to understand a system he had underestimated. One night he stood at the edge of the staff meal while she portioned stew into bowls. "You always serve them first," he said. Rosalie glanced at him. "Staff? Yes. They have been cooking for other people for 10 hours. You eat last. I am not going to starve in the next 5 minutes." Lorenzo watched Luis take a bowl and leave. "And you remember who does not eat pork. That is literally part of my job. Not everyone does it." Rosalie set down the ladle. "You are doing it again." "What?" "Studying me." Lorenzo did not deny it. "Should I stop?" The question surprised her enough that she took a second before answering. "Sometimes that is imprecise. You will survive." His gaze held hers. "I am beginning to suspect you enjoy telling me that." The first solid break in the investigation came the following afternoon. The staffing agency confirmed Calvin Reese had never worked at a Carvelli property before, but his application included a contact number that security traced to a prepaid account. That alone meant little. The useful detail came from garage footage. 2 nights before the dinner, Calvin had met a man beside a loading warehouse owned by one of the Carvelli import companies. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. The man was known. Dario Melfi had worked within Carvelli operations for almost a decade, mostly managing vendor relationships and distribution accounts. Lorenzo watched the footage in silence. Rosalie stood near the back. Security had asked her to confirm whether Calvin was the same porter. "That is him," she said, and the other man Lorenzo answered before security did. "Dario." The name carried weight. Rosalie noticed. "You know him well." "Well enough." His expression became unreadable. The security chief placed a second file on the table. Dario had approved the emergency staffing agency for the residents 3 months earlier. He had also signed off on one of the spice import invoices connected to the dinner. None of that proved sabotage. Together, it created a line worth following. Lorenzo closed the file. "No one contacts him yet." Rosalie looked at him. "That sounds like restraint. Do not become impressed. I was not in danger." He almost smiled. Adrian's warning had apparently done something, and Lorenzo stopped before the expression fully formed. Instead, he asked security for financial records, vendor approvals, and all communication between Dario and the staffing agency. Evidence first, action later. As the meeting ended, Rosalie gathered her notes and headed for the door. "Lorenzo," said her name. She turned. "You were right yesterday," he said. "About what investigating before deciding." The admission was quiet enough that anyone else might have missed how much it cost him. Rosalie studied him. That lesson came fast. 30 seconds. Apparently, She smiled, despite herself. Do not waste it. Lorenzo looked at her longer than necessary. I do not intend to. Behind him, the paused security footage still showed Dario Melfi standing beside the temporary porter 2 nights before the contaminated dinner. For the first time, Lorenzo had a reason to believe the problem had never been inside his kitchen at all. It had been inside his organization. The financial records changed the shape of the investigation before noon. Dario Melfi had been skimming percentages from a distribution channel tied to imported spirits, specialty foods, and several private club accounts for almost 2 years. The money was not large enough to threaten Carvelli operations. It was steady, hidden inside inflated vendor costs and shell invoices that depended on one thing remaining unchanged: Adrian Carvelli staying out of the restructuring deal. If Adrian signed the agreement currently on Lorenzo's desk, the entire channel would be consolidated under legitimate accounting and audited from the ground up. Dario's private revenue would disappear. Lorenzo stood at the head of the security table while spreadsheets, badge, locks, and camera stills covered the polished wood. So he wanted Adrian out of the deal, Roman said. Lorenzo's gaze remained on the records. Yes, by poisoning him, Rosalie, who had been asked to confirm kitchen procedures, shook her head. We still do not know he intended to poison anyone. Lorenzo looked at her. She continued. The contaminant could make someone sick. That is not the same as proving he intended to kill them. Roman's expression hardened. You are defending him. No. I am defending facts. The laboratory report arrived that afternoon. The substance introduced into the sauce was a concentrated industrial additive that could cause severe gastrointestinal illness in the amount detected. It was especially dangerous in a rich meal, but not a reliable murder weapon. That mattered. Dario had not been trying to assassinate Lorenzo. He had been trying to create a public disaster around Adrian's dinner, an ambulance leaving the Carvelli residence, a hospital report, questions about kitchen safety. Adrian already doubted Lorenzo's leadership and wanted distance from the family's older business practices. A food poisoning scandal could have pushed him to withdraw from the deal completely. Lorenzo read the report twice, then closed it. He used my house, he said. His voice was quiet enough that Rosalie felt the room tighten. He used my staff. Roman leaned back. And now we know why. Lorenzo looked toward the door. Bring Dario in. Rosalie's attention sharpened. For what Lorenzo's eyes moved to her. A conversation. The word was too smooth. She had worked in the residence long enough to understand when ordinary words carried extraordinary meanings. Dario arrived willingly. He did not yet know how much they had. He entered Lorenzo's private office in a dark suit and greeted Roman by name. He gave Rosalie a brief, confused look when he saw her standing by the window. Lorenzo did not accuse him immediately. He asked about vendor approvals. Dario answered cleanly. He asked about Calvin Reese. Dario said he barely remembered the name. Lorenzo placed a still image from the garage on the desk. Dario's face changed by less than a second. Rosalie noticed. So did Lorenzo. You met him 2 nights before the dinner, Lorenzo said. Dario glanced at the image. I meet temporary staff all the time. Beside a warehouse after 11 at night. He had questions about agency work. Lorenzo placed the financial records beside the photograph. And your questions about inflated invoices. Dario stopped talking. Lorenzo leaned back, his expression becoming almost empty. You were not trying to kill me. Dario's eyes shifted. Of course not. You were trying to make Adrian sick. No. Careful. One word. Dario swallowed. Rosalie should not have been in the room when Lorenzo's world revealed itself. But leaving would have felt like pretending she had not already understood. Dario began bargaining without ever using the word bargain. He called the kitchen incident a mistake. He said Calvin had been told only to create a food problem. Nothing serious. He insisted he never expected anyone to be badly hurt. Roman's face became colder with each sentence. Lorenzo barely moved. You paid someone to tamper with food served inside my house, he said. Dario spread his hands. I was protecting a revenue stream that supports people who depend on us. You were stealing from it, taking a percentage. Roman gave a humorless laugh. Dario looked at Lorenzo again. I made one bad decision. Lorenzo's voice lowered. You used people who trusted this house to be safe. Rosalie saw then that the insult was not only financial. Lorenzo's kitchen, staff, and family table had been penetrated. Someone inside his organization had treated them as mere assets. After Dario was escorted from the office, Rosalie waited until Roman left before speaking. What happens to him now? Lorenzo turned toward her. You do not need to know. The answer made something inside her tighten. That is not reassuring. It was not meant to be. She looked at the door Dario had disappeared through. Are you going to hurt him? Lorenzo's expression went still. Rosalie, that is a yes or no question. In my world. Not always. She folded her arms. Then give me the version you can say. He walked toward the desk and gathered the financial records into one stack. Dario will no longer have access to Carvelli businesses, and after that depends on what else we find. Rosalie watched him carefully. If you turn what happened in my kitchen into an excuse to settle this with violence, I am done. Lorenzo looked up. Your kitchen? Yes. The one you keep visiting while pretending it belongs entirely to you. His eyes cooled. Dario endangered my family. I know. He compromised my house. I know. And you believe termination paperwork is sufficient? Rosalie stepped closer. I believe you are asking the wrong question. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. Which is, whether what he did gives you permission to become whatever version of yourself makes you feel powerful again. Silence settled between them. She knew she was pushing too far, and did it anyway. You were wrong about me because fear made you decide before you knew the facts. Do not make the same mistake with him just because this time he actually deserves consequences. Lorenzo's gaze sharpened. Do not confuse restraint with weakness. I am not. I am asking whether you know the difference between consequence and revenge. For several seconds, neither moved. Lorenzo finally said, There are things in my world that cannot be handled like an employee dispute. Rosalie's stomach tightened. That is the first honest thing you have said about your world. His face changed by a fraction. You knew what family you worked for. I knew the name. I knew people were afraid of you. I knew there were questions nobody asked. She looked toward the closed office door. Knowing something is bad is not the same as standing close enough to see what it really is. Lorenzo stepped nearer, stopping before he crowded her. Then step away. The words were quiet, not cruel. Rosalie looked at him. Is that what you want? He did not answer immediately. It may be what is safest. That was not my question. His eyes held hers. The distance between them became too precise, too noticeable. No, he said at last. It is not what I want. Rosalie should have left then. Instead, she stayed. Perhaps because Lorenzo had finally answered without hiding behind ownership or security. Perhaps because anger and attraction had been circling each other for weeks and had run out of room. What do you want? She asked. Lorenzo looked at her mouth before he looked back at her eyes. You should not ask questions you already know the answer to. That sounds like avoidance. It is restraint. Her pulse shifted. Those are not always the same thing. The line almost made him smile. He moved one hand to the edge of the desk beside her. Still not touching. You enjoy correcting me. Someone has to. Dangerous hobby. You fired me. I came back. Your threats are losing value. Something in his expression broke. Not control exactly. but distance. Rosalie saw the moment he stopped pretending the attraction was a distraction he could outwait. The kiss began because she did not step back when he leaned toward her. Lorenzo moved slowly enough that refusal remained possible until the final inch. Rosalie closed that inch herself. His mouth met hers with a restraint that lasted barely a second. Heat sharpened beneath the kiss. One of her hands caught the front of his shirt. His palm settled at her waist, broad and careful, despite the tension running through him. Rosalie felt the dangerous part of wanting him precisely because he had spent so much time trying to make everything around him obey. She kissed him harder. Lorenzo answered. Control, fraying just enough to make the moment feel honest. Then footsteps sounded somewhere beyond the office corridor. Lorenzo's hand tightened at her waist. Stay, he said against her mouth. Rosalie stopped immediately. Lorenzo felt it and released her before she had to move. She stepped back, breathing harder than she wanted him to see. There, his brow tightened. What? You did it again. The heat in his expression cooled to concentration. Did what? Turned something you wanted into an order. Rosalie touched her lower lip, angry that part of her still wanted to close the distance again. You could have asked. Lorenzo looked at her for a long moment. He did not argue that the word had been harmless. He did not tell her she had misunderstood. That mattered. Will you stay? He asked. The difference between the two sentences should have been small. It was not. Rosalie let the silence stretch. For 10 minutes. Lorenzo nodded. 10. And we are not finishing that. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth. Tonight, she gave him a warning look. Do not push your luck. I am learning where it ends. Slowly. Apparently. Rosalie moved toward the small seating area instead of the door. Lorenzo followed without touching her. For the next 10 minutes. They did not discuss the kiss. They discussed Dario. Lorenzo told her the immediate plan. Access would be terminated. Accounts frozen, where lawful. Evidence preserved. Financial crimes documented. And no action taken beyond what the evidence actually justified. Rosalie understood there were still parts he did not tell her. For tonight, she accepted that secrecy and restraint would remain unresolved. Before she left, Lorenzo said, You were right about one thing. Rosalie looked back. Only one. Do not become ambitious. His expression stayed serious. Dario does not get to decide what kind of man I become because of what he did. Rosalie studied him, then nodded. That is a better lesson than the 30-second one. More expensive. Those usually are. She walked out of his office and returned downstairs, where the kitchen was finishing late cleanup and tomorrow's bread was already proofing beneath linen. Lorenzo remained alone beside the desk. Dario's file sat closed in front of him. Rosalie's absence made the room feel too big. He had spent most of his life believing power meant never needing to ask twice. Sometimes, the first thing he needed to do was ask correctly. Dario Melfi did not disappear. That was the first thing Rosalie noticed. No whispered stories moved through the kitchen. No unexplained absence became a warning. Nobody was allowed to discuss. Instead, over the next 2 weeks, Dario's name vanished from schedules, vendor approvals, transport authorizations, and every Carvelli business account he had once touched. Lorenzo's security team preserved the footage, connecting him to Calvin Reese. Accountants traced the inflated invoices and percentages he had been taking from the distribution channel. A legitimate financial investigation opened through outside counsel after the evidence showed enough fraud to survive scrutiny beyond the Carvelli family. Calvin, facing his own charges for food tampering and unauthorized access, admitted he had been paid to create an illness serious enough to derail Adrian's dinner. He said he had been told not to kill anyone. Rosalie learned only what directly concerned the kitchen. Lorenzo did not bring photographs of Dario's downfall downstairs as proof of justice. He simply told her, "He no longer has access to this house." She studied him for a moment. And you managed that without anyone vanishing into the Hudson. Lorenzo's expression barely moved. Your confidence in my restraint is touching. I am grading on a curve. The kitchen returned to routine, though not quite to normal. Rosalie ran family meals under the revised safety authority she had negotiated, and Lorenzo kept his promise not to interfere with decisions that belonged to her. If she stopped an ingredient, security was notified. If a temporary worker entered the wrong zone, the access log was checked before accusations were made. The changes affected everyone, not only Rosalie. That mattered more than any apology he could have given her. Yet Lorenzo himself became less predictable. Some evenings he appeared at the staff table with espresso and said almost nothing. Other nights he stayed upstairs entirely. The kiss in his office remained between them like a private line. Neither had crossed again. Rosalie told herself that was sensible. She was still his employee. He was still a man whose name could end conversations in rooms she would never enter. Wanting him did not change the imbalance. Lorenzo seemed to understand that too, or at least understand enough to keep his hands to himself. That restraint should have made things easier. Instead, Rosalie found herself noticing every time he chose it. The problem began with a car she saw 3 nights in a row. A dark sedan waited half a block from her apartment when she came home after late service. The first night, she ignored it. The second, she memorized the plate. The third, she crossed the street deliberately and watched the driver lift his phone before she came within 20 feet. Rosalie stopped. She did not need proof beyond that. The next morning, she walked into Lorenzo's office without an appointment and placed the plate number on his desk. Yours, Lorenzo looked at it once. His silence answered before he did. Rosalie's stomach tightened. You put someone outside my building. After Dario was exposed. That was not my question. Yes. She stared at him. How long? 11 days. And you were planning to tell me when? Lorenzo's expression remained controlled. When the risk changed. Rosalie laughed once. Sharp and humorless. Of course. Lorenzo stood. Dario knew your name. Calvin knew you identified the food problem. There were people around both men whose loyalties were unclear. So you assigned someone to watch my home, to watch the street. Do not insult me with wording. Rosalie's voice stayed low, but anger sharpened every syllable. You did not ask. You would have said no. That is not a defense. No. The admission came quickly, which only made her angrier. Then why Lorenzo looked at her for a long moment. Because I believed the threat justified it. Rosalie closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, disappointment had replaced some of the anger. You fired me once because you did not trust me to know what was happening in my own kitchen. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. That is not the same. No. This is worse. She stepped closer to the desk. Now I am leaving because you still do not trust me to choose what happens in my own life. The word leaving altered the room. Lorenzo went completely still. You are resigning. It was not a question. Rosalie reached into her bag and took out the envelope she had written before coming upstairs. Some part of her had known the answer before she asked about the car. Yes. He looked at the envelope, but did not touch it. Remove the detail and stay. You still think the problem is the car. It can be corrected. That is exactly what you do. You correct the system and assume the person inside it will stay where you put them. Lorenzo's eyes hardened. I am trying to keep you alive, and I am trying to live a life that belongs to me. Rosalie pushed the envelope toward him. You do not get to decide that fear makes consent optional. For one dangerous second, Rosalie thought Lorenzo might refuse. Not the resignation legally, but the feeling. She saw the instinct in him transfer her. Increase protection. Move her somewhere safer. Find a solution large enough to make leaving unnecessary. Then something changed. Perhaps he heard his own voice from the night he fired her. Perhaps he remembered Dario turning people into tools and telling himself it was practical. Perhaps he finally understood that keeping someone was not the same as protecting them. Lorenzo picked up the resignation letter. "When is your last day?" Rosalie had not expected the question to hurt. "End of the week." "Do you have another position?" "Not yet." His gaze sharpened, and she lifted one hand. "Do not. I was going to ask whether you wanted a recommendation." Rosalie stopped. "Oh." Lorenzo's mouth moved slightly. "Disappointing. Confusing. You will survive." The phrase was hers. Hearing it from him almost broke the tension. Adrian found Lorenzo alone later that afternoon. Rosalie never heard the conversation directly, but Adrian told her part of it weeks later. He had entered Lorenzo's office, seen the resignation letter on the desk, and understood immediately. "You put security on her without asking," he said. Lorenzo did not answer. Adrian poured himself coffee. 30 seconds proved she was competent. Apparently, it took 4 months to learn she was free. Lorenzo looked at him with a coldness that would have silenced anyone else. Adrian drank anyway. "You cannot keep confusing access with permission." Lorenzo's voice came low. "I know. Do you?" Adrian nodded toward the letter. "Because she seems to be the one paying tuition for the lesson." Lorenzo's expression changed at that. Not anger. Shame. Perhaps. Though he would never have named it. "What would you have me do?" he asked. Adrian shrugged. "Nothing. That is probably why it feels impossible." Rosalie's final week passed without drama. The security car disappeared that afternoon and did not return. Lorenzo did not ask where she planned to interview. He did not send recruiters, offers, or gifts. Chef Marco wrote her a recommendation so generous she suspected Lorenzo had not touched it. That made her trust it more. Luis organized a staff dinner on her last night and burned 1 tray of garlic bread because nobody had let him cook unsupervised before. Rosalie laughed until she cried, which she blamed on smoke. Near midnight, she packed her knives and stood for a moment in the kitchen she had rebuilt, after Lorenzo nearly threw her out of it. The new security line remained beside the office. Tamper-evident seals lined the spice shelves. Temporary staff access zones were clearly marked. Some things had changed because she insisted. That mattered. Lorenzo waited in the service corridor, but not in front of the exit. Rosalie noticed the choice immediately. "This is becoming a habit," she said. "Standing in my own house, appearing after my last shift. You only get one last shift." "Good point." She held the knife roll against her side. For several seconds, neither spoke. The attraction between them had not disappeared with anger. That would have been easier. Lorenzo looked at her the way he had in the pantry, with too much control and too much wanting beneath it. "I removed the detail," he said. "I know. No one has been assigned to you. Thank you." His face tightened slightly at the gratitude. "Do not thank me for correcting something I should not have done." Rosalie studied him. That sounded almost healthy. "Do not spread it around." She smiled, then looked toward the exit. "I meant what I said. I cannot stay here and figure out what this is at the same time. Lorenzo's Hase hält hers. I know, and I do not want you solving my next job. I know. Or buying a restaurant. I had not considered that." Rosalie raised an eyebrow. Lorenzo paused. "Recently," she laughed despite herself. "You are impossible." "Apparently not. You keep leaving." The words carried more honesty than he probably intended. Rosalie's expression softened. "I need to know I can." Lorenzo nodded once. "You can." He did not kiss her. That was the thing she remembered most. Lorenzo could have asked. She might even have said yes. Instead, he opened the service door and stepped aside. Cold night air moved into the corridor. Rosalie walked through, then turned back. "What happens now?" she asked. Lorenzo looked at her from inside the house that carried his name. You decide what happens to you. And you. His answer took longer. I learned to live with that. Rosalie held his gaze for one more moment, then left. The following morning, Lorenzo rewrote the household security protocol. No non-emergency protective detail could be assigned to an employee or family guest without informed approval. Kitchen security remained under the system Rosalie had helped build. Temporary staff vetting moved in-house. Roman called the new consent requirement unnecessarily complicated. Lorenzo told him complexity was not an argument. He also changed the internal review process that had allowed suspicion to become punishment too quickly. None of it brought Rosalie back. That was the point. 2 days later, Lorenzo received a message from Adrian. Rosalie had accepted an interview at an independent restaurant in Brooklyn. Lorenzo read the message once and deleted it. He did not ask for the restaurant's name. For a man accustomed to knowing everything, it was the hardest thing he had done all week. 4 months after Rosalie Bennett left the Carvelli residence, Lorenzo walked into a Brooklyn restaurant and waited 23 minutes for a table. Nobody cleared the room for him. Nobody moved another reservation. He had called under his own name and accepted the only available seating time. He arrived without Roman or visible security. The restaurant was narrow, warm, and louder than any dining room Lorenzo normally chose, with exposed brick, a short, open kitchen, and tables close enough that neighboring conversations blended into one constant hum. Rosalie worked behind the pass in a white chef's coat, her hair pinned high, moving between 2 cooks with the same steady authority she had once carried through his private kitchen. She did not see him at first. Lorenzo preferred it that way. He watched her taste a sauce, reject 1 plate for sloppy presentation, and laugh when a line cook nearly dropped a tray of bread. There was no tension in her shoulders, no awareness that one wrong decision might call the owner of the building down from upstairs. She looked lighter without him. Lorenzo disliked the realization and accepted it anyway. Rosalie noticed him when she carried a plate toward the pass and looked into the dining room. Her hand stopped for less than a second. Then she finished the plate, called for service, and went back to work. Lorenzo ordered dinner. He did not ask for her. When dessert arrived, it was a pear tart, with no message written in chocolate and no special treatment. He ate all of it. Only after the kitchen closed did Rosalie come out wearing a dark coat over her uniform. "You waited," she said. Lorenzo stood. "Yes. You could have told someone who you were and had them drag me out of the kitchen." "I considered it." Rosalie gave him a flat look. "That is not growth. I did not do it." Marginal growth. Something close to amusement moved through his expression. Rosalie looked toward the empty dining room. "Why are you here?" Lorenzo reached into his coat and handed her a business card. Not his. Hers. Rosalie stared at it. Bennett, Private Catering. The card had been printed 2 weeks earlier after she began taking small independent jobs on her days off. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Adrian." Her eyes narrowed. "I told him not to recruit clients for me." "He did not." "I asked whether you were taking private bookings." "That sounds dangerously close." Lorenzo did not argue. "I need a chef for a family dinner." Rosalie folded her arms. "You have 3 chefs at the residence. I am not asking you to return to work there." "Then what are you asking?" He held her gaze. "A catering contract. 1 dinner. Your menu. Your staff if you want them. Your terms. You invoice me as an independent business." Rosalie searched his face for the hidden structure. "And why me?" "Because Adrian asked for you." Lorenzo paused. "And because I trust your kitchen." The answer caught her more than she expected. Months earlier, he had fired her before asking why she emptied a pan. Now he was standing in someone else's restaurant, admitting trust without dressing it as authority. "No security assigned to me," she asked. "Not unless the event itself requires standard property security." No people outside my apartment. No. No investigating who works with me. Lorenzo's mouth tightened. Background checks on outside staff. Entering the residence are standard. Rosalie considered that. Standard, and disclosed. Yes. She nodded slowly. Send me the event details. I will decide after I see them. Lorenzo accepted the answer. That, more than the offer, was why she eventually said yes. The family dinner took place 3 weeks later. Adrian attended. Lorenzo's sister came with her husband. Roman appeared late and complained about being assigned a seat beside a cousin he disliked. No business associates were invited. No one discussed Dario, whose financial case had moved into the hands of legitimate investigators, while his access to Carvelli companies remained permanently severed. The revenue stream he had been protecting was gone. Adrian and Lorenzo had finished restructuring the hospitality accounts, cutting off the gray channels Adrian had objected to, and placing the legitimate businesses under outside auditing. Rosalie knew only what Adrian had told her voluntarily. She did not ask for the rest. Her job that night was food. She arrived with 2 assistants from the Brooklyn restaurant and her own equipment. She carried her invoices and a contract bearing Bennett Private Catering across the top. Lorenzo signed without changing a word. For the first hour, being back in the old house felt almost uncomfortable. Same marble service corridor. Same gleaming kitchen. Same family dining room beyond the swinging doors. But Rosalie no longer belonged to the house. That changed everything. When one oven began heating unevenly during the second course, Chef Marco automatically looked toward the hall. He seemed to expect Lorenzo to appear. Rosalie caught the reaction and smiled. Relax. It is an oven, not a coup. She shifted trays, adjusted the timing, and moved the vegetables to another heat source. A few minutes later, Lorenzo appeared at the kitchen entrance. Every old instinct in the room tightened. Rosalie looked at him. He did not step inside. Do you need anything? He asked. The question was so simple that Marco actually turned to stare. Rosalie looked at the oven, then back at Lorenzo. No, I have it. His answer came without hesitation. I know. Then he left. Rosalie stood still for 1 second after he disappeared. One of her assistants whispered, Was that him? Rosalie resumed plating. Unfortunately, he seemed polite. Do not spread rumors. But the words stayed with her. I know. Not prove it. Not explain. Not let me fix it. I know. The dinner went upstairs 10 minutes later with no disaster. No contaminated sauce. And no one being fired. Adrian found Rosalie after dessert and leaned against the kitchen doorway. He had the satisfied expression of a man who enjoyed being right. You noticed, he said. Noticed what he did not interfere. Your family has very low standards for personal development. Adrian laughed. True. Still counts. Rosalie wiped down her station. He also paid the invoice deposit on time. That may be the greater miracle. When the final plates were cleared, Rosalie packed her knives and sent her assistants home. She expected Lorenzo to appear before she left. He did not. She found him, instead, in the small breakfast room, sitting alone with coffee and a copy of her final invoice beside him. Are you auditing me? She asked. Lorenzo looked up. Paying you. That is less offensive. She sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Months apart had changed the tension between them without removing it. Rosalie no longer felt like an employee sitting across from the man who could end her livelihood. Lorenzo no longer had the excuse of authority to hide behind. You did well tonight, he said. I know. His eyes narrowed slightly. You stole my line. I improved it. Lorenzo folded the invoice once and set it aside. How is the restaurant? Good. And the certification? Rosalie blinked. Adrian again. Public Culinary Association listing. She studied him. You checked once. That sounds suspiciously like monitoring. I searched the certification schedule because you mentioned it before you left. Rosalie held his gaze until he added, "Nothing else." She believed him. "Exam is next month. You will pass." That sounded almost supportive. "Do not exaggerate." Rosalie smiled. The silence that followed felt softer than the silences they'd had in his office. Lorenzo looked at her for a long moment. Then, he said, "I owe you an apology that is not attached to employment, policy, or security." Rosalie's expression changed. He continued before she could interrupt. "I fired you because I decided fear was evidence. Then, I watched you long enough to understand you were competent and still assumed that knowing you gave me permission to protect you without asking." His jaw tightened. It did not. Rosalie looked down at her hands. "No, I know that now. Knowing is easier when I am not on your payroll." "Yes." Lorenzo leaned back slightly. "Which is why I waited." She looked up, for what his gaze remained steady. "For tonight." Rosalie felt her pulse shift. "That sounds ominous." "It is a question. You are improving already." Lorenzo ignored the comment. "Will you have dinner with me when you are not working? No family event. No contract. No private chef arrangement. No hidden command inside professional necessity. Just the question." Rosalie let the silence stretch long enough to remind him that waiting was part of asking. Where she said finally, "Your choice. No private club. Fine. No restaurant you own. Ah. Pause. That eliminates several options. Survive." The corner of his mouth moved. "I have been told I can." Rosalie smiled. "Friday. 7. Lorenzo nodded. "I will pick you up." Her eyebrow rose. "You will ask whether I want you to pick me up." He exhaled through his nose. "Do you want me to pick you up?" "No. I will meet you there." "Fine. You hate this." "Profoundly." "Good." Rosalie stood. But Lorenzo did not. That was another change. He did not use height, proximity, or silence to pull her back into the room. "One more thing," she said. "What if Friday goes badly? I am allowed to leave." His expression went serious. "Always." The answer came too quickly to doubt. Rosalie looked at him for several seconds. She remembered the man who had once fired her without listening, and the man who later put security outside her home when fear made permission optional. Neither version had vanished. Lorenzo had not become gentle. He had become more deliberate about where his power ended. She walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back. "Lorenzo." He raised his eyes. "Yes," Rosalie smiled. "The pear tart tonight was better than the one at my restaurant." His expression shifted into surprise. "That was yours, no? Marco made it." She laughed when he realized she had tricked him. For one rare second, Lorenzo Carvelli looked less like the head of a mafia family and more like a man who had been caught enjoying something. The first time Rosalie stood in his kitchen with a pan of dangerous sauce between them, Lorenzo needed less than 30 seconds to decide she was guilty. By the time 30 seconds passed, he had learned she was the most competent person in the room. It had taken him much longer to learn the harder lesson. Competence did not make her his to command. Loyalty did not make her his to control. And love, if they were ever going to call it that, would not make her his at all. Friday night, Rosalie walked into a restaurant Lorenzo did not own and found him waiting at an ordinary table. He stood. He did not pull out the chair. He waited until she reached it. "May I?" he asked. Rosalie looked at the chair, then at him. "Yes." This time, he had asked, and this time, she chose to stay.